See a lot of you on the screen there this morning. We're just waiting. Our session will start at about midday Bangkok time, so in a couple of minutes. We already have a large number of people who have joined us today, and it's lovely to see so many of you. Could I just suggest that you all put your microphone on mute so that the background noise is minimised? And if at any time during the session, if it starts going slow or there's some delay, I would recommend you turning your video off. And the video at your end, you can still see the video, but the video off at your end will certainly help with the connection strength. So I'll just put my music on again, just so you can test the noise at your end, the sound at your end. That's for you there in New Zealand, Gary.
A nice one.
All right, well, I think that we might make a start. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Gemma Van Hargen. I'm the Director of the Statistics Division in UNESCAP, and it's a real pleasure to be joining you this afternoon or this morning, wherever you may be. This is the second in a new series we've created called the Stats Café. And it really is an opportunity to bring to you some advice and some assistance on issues that you've been asking us, and also in particular to allow a question and answer time where you can ask us questions directly and we can respond to you. Just in terms of this technology that you're using here today, it's called MS Teams. And if you scroll your mouse into the middle of the screen, a black bar will come up. And there's some features in MS Teams which you should be aware of. So the first little icon there on the left-hand side shows you your video is on or off. And certainly I would recommend that you keep your video off during this series. The second one is the microphone button, and again, I would encourage you to keep the microphone on mute, please. This will help focus our speakers, our presenters here today into clarity of the sound. The third button is for screening, presenters will use to share their screen. You'll also see on the black bar a little hand. There is a hand function for asking questions in MS Teams, and we'll certainly be using this functionality during the question and answer time. You just press the hand up and we will come to you and your questions. Also, or if you prefer, there is next to the hand function a little messaging button where if you press on that message button on the right hand side of the screen, a meeting chat box will scroll up on the right hand side. You can type your questions into the meeting chat function or share information in that meeting chat function. So you can reach out to us either with the hand function or the meeting chat function. So just a reminder, please just keep your button on mute, your microphone on mute throughout the cafe series. There's a little bit of noise in the background at the moment, so I would encourage you all to please check your mute is on so that we can run through the presentations. So today we're going to have three presentations followed by the question and answer, and we've actually scheduled this topic today to be about the impact of COVID-19 on survey operations, with a particular focus on household surveys. And we're really pleased to bring to you our own expertise from ESCAP, as well as expertise from UNICEF Asia Pacific and the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Next Monday, we will also be holding another cafe series, and this series will be about how to undertake rapid response COVID-19 socio-economic assessment surveys. So today's topic is more about the impact of COVID on your operations. Next week, we will discuss how you may want to stand up a rapid response survey on the impact of socio-economic impact of COVID-19 in your countries. And I know several of you have already stood up new rapid response surveys in response to COVID-19. So without further ado, I might now hand over to Arman from ESCAP, who will be sharing with us his expertise around the impact of COVID-19 on survey operations. Thank you very much, Arman. Over to you.
Thank you, Gemma, and hello, colleagues. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you can see my screen and my slides.
Yes.
Is it in the full slideshow?
Yes.
Good. So my presentation will focus on three topics today, and it aims to provide the context for the following presentations. So it will cover three areas. We'll discuss how the pandemic situation will impact our four different types of data collection procedures and data sources. We'll then talk about some of the key quality issues that we might have to consider when we are redesigning our data collection procedures. And then I will also share with you some ideas on how we might go about tackling some of those quality issues if we adopt different modes of data collection. So if we consider four different types of data sources, survey, censuses, admin data, and big data as main sources for production of official statistics. Each of those differently affected by the pandemic situation. Under the lockdown, and by the way, when I say lockdown, of course, it may vary in different countries. It have different degree of impact. So let us consider lockdown situation, any kind of disruption to our current survey operation with different degrees and varieties in different countries. So when it comes to surveys and censuses, especially those conducted through a face-to-face data collection, of course, the maximum impact could be a shutdown, a temporary shutdown during the lockdown situation, right? And of course, in terms of censuses, we might afford to postpone them unless they are in the middle of operation. But in terms of surveys, especially those aim to produce the short-term important indicators, we may not afford to postpone them. And then some sort of redesigning and adoption of different modes of data collection will be needed. Admin data are differently affected unless the government operation is completely stopped. The admin data will be affected basically through the quality and coverage of the data rather than completely stopping entire operation, right? And then of course the improving the quality and the constant monitoring and evaluation of those becomes important rather than a redesign of them. But the story is very different when it comes to big data. Actually, it's positive more than negative. It is making big data this situation, making it even more relevant. And we can see that lots of NSOs and statistical systems are now thinking or already using big data for official statistics. So today's focus is on surveys. Each of those other sources will require different discussion, but our focus is on how we wanted to handle surveys under this situation. But before we talk about equality, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about why do we need to run those surveys, because this question often might be also asked by those who are interested to change the priorities and not really fund some of the statistical operations. We know that the pandemic situation is complex, and of course it requires agile policy response, which cannot be effective without timely information, and that's one of the key reasons why we need to run our surveys under this situation. But also for the recovery after the pandemic, the post-pandemic policies will need information about how the society and economy was impacted and how it was reacted and changed. So that's the second important reason. And the third is, of course, the situation will end one day, hopefully soon, but then we don't want to have a gap in our time series for future analysis. And a very important period of time without data will cause a lot of issues there. So if we are going to continue some of our regular and important household surveys, in particular during lockdown situation, I have categorized here 4 different quality issues that we might have to think about and make sure that whatever approach we are taking is really taking care of those in one way or another. First quality aspect is the design effect. Of course, if you change the mode of data collection, your sampling frame might be completely different, or you need different information in your sampling frame, such as the telephone number or other information, which may not be available or partially available, which affect your design. But also sample size will be different when you change your mode, and the domain of estimation, even your design in terms of stratification and clustering might be different, which is desirable to maintain the same. But all of those are issues that need to be considered. The second important factor which relates to quality is mode effect. By mode effect, I mean when you change the mode of data collection, you cannot go with exactly the same questionnaire that you used to implement. Therefore, the type of questions, the number of questions will change, but also the quality of answer will be different. People are not as friendly in the telephone service, for example, as they are in face-to-face. Or the type of answers they provide to sensitive questions might be different. Therefore, there is an effect, and we need to really make sure that we are observing and kind of understanding that effect in our data collection. The third is non-response. Of course, every survey, and we're talking about household surveys here, non-response is an issue, but we are always hoping that it is following a sort of a random pattern, and the size of non-response is not very significant to affect our results. But when you change the mode of your data collection, it might impact your non-response not only in the pattern, which is no longer random, but also in terms of the size of non-response. And that's another thing that we would want to know and understand it when we change our mode. And the third and the fourth and the last is interruption in our temporal change, because, of course, as I mentioned, any discontinuation of your time series will interrupt your measurement of change over time. But even if you include the same questions, not being able to maintain the linkage between different panels and different samples over time may interrupt the time series and your ability to measure the change over time. So all of those 4 issues, of course, there are a lot more you can list, but I just wanted to highlight a few important ones here. And then here I want to share with you a few ideas. Just let me highlight, this is not a recommendation of UN or any kind of tested design here. I just share with you a hypothetical design where I want to illustrate and highlight how we can, to some extent possible, actually address some of the quality issues. Imagine if you have a survey running throughout the year, and you have a sample for entire year, and then of course you have conducted a survey before the lockdown or pandemic situation, which we call it A here, pre-pandemic phase, and suddenly you cannot continue your face-to-face interview, and then you have to change. So first thing we can do is to run a pilot survey, and it is very important. And if we could make sure that the sample we are using for our pilot survey is taken from the sample we had previously and we interviewed them, it will help us to understand the effect of different modes and select the most appropriate, a combination at least of modes. And then the second phase, which is the lockdown phase, you run your survey monthly, assuming here, and each month one possibility is to make sure that you split your sample and have a repeated sample, which is coming from the previous month, and continue to the last month of the lockdown. And then when the situation is better and you can go back to your face-to-face interview, which is called post-pandemic phase here, you again might consider to split your sample for the first month into 3 parts, which one part is again the same overlapping sample from the previous month, but then you might include one small sample of your non-response during the lockdown to understand the non-response effect, and then the last part would be the new sample. And then for the next month, you don't have to have the non-response and continue the same sample with 2 splits. So let's see how different overlaps here help us to tackle actually the quality aspects that I just mentioned in the previous slide. One I just said, talked about, which is the sample from pre-pandemic, help us to understand and identify the best mode. The second overlap here is the non-response from the lockdown situation, which if you conduct this, if you interview them using face-to-face mode during the post-pandemic, then you can understand how the non-response pattern changes because of your mode, and you have a better idea of that error. The third type of overlap here is 3 overlaps in the first and the last month of lockdown and the first month of pandemic, where you interview these subsamples with 2 different modes. One is basically face-to-face, another one is a new mode or mix of modes that you have chosen in your pilot. And that will basically help you to understand and capture the mode effect. And of course, that's an important error, need to be explained. And the last type of overlap, which is our monthly overlap of samples from the previous month, which will help us to capture our temporal change, as I mentioned, as the last quality issue. So again, this is an example, a hypothetical example. Of course, in each situation, in each country, the design and the frame and the objective of survey will decide how you redesign your survey, but these are more food for thought for us to think about possible ways of addressing those and how important it is to think about it at the design stage to address those challenges. So to summarize, it is important to notice that during the lockdown, we don't necessarily have to stop all the survey operations. For some of them, it's very important to find alternative ways. It is also not all bad. Sometimes it is really an opportunity for us to explore new ways of data collection, new data sources such as big data, admin data, new techniques and designs that might help us to come up with more effective and less costly way of data collection in the future. But also some of the issues that we are dealing with here can make us think about how we can improve our frames, because this is not the last time we will be in this kind of situation. The third takeaway is the quality. I want to emphasize is extremely important, and we have to keep that as our top priority when we are changing our data collection procedures, but also keeping in mind that lockdown will end finally, of course, but we will have to have comparable data. So data we are producing during this time will have to be combined with other sources or being used together with other sources of data. So we have to make sure that we maximize the comparability and minimize the impact on the quality. I'll stop here and we'll hand it over to my colleague Kieran Walsh from ILO Geneva office. Senior statistician from ILO will share with us more specific recommendations and information on the labor force survey. Kieran,
thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you, Arman. No, we possibly have to stop sharing. Yes, and then I'll share. Okay. Just let me know if my screen appears for you.
Yes.
You can see it? Okay. And you can hear me okay?
I hear you okay.
Okay. So, yeah, very much following on from Arman, the ILO has been working on guidance on household surveys and how to maintain them, with a particular focus on the labour force survey and labour market statistics. And we have a lot of very similar advice to UNESCAP, but some more focused advice as well on the LFS. To give the background, because of a very short period for this, I just want to make sure everyone is aware of the type of guidance we're producing and some of the main things to be aware of. By now, we have published 4 complementary notes, so they come together to give advice on the impact of COVID-19 on labour market statistics. The first note, which we published right at the end of March, was an overview of country challenges and responses based on information we got from 100 countries approximately in the early weeks of COVID, saying how they were being impacted and what types of things they were doing, just so we could share that information. The second was very specifically on the labour force survey content, what kind of content needs to be there and how to treat some special cases. I'll mention it briefly later. And then the third note, which is what I'm mainly focusing on today, is the different options available to maintain labour force survey data collection. And there is a fourth note now published, which is a guide on capturing impacts on employment and unpaid work using rapid surveys. And this will be the topic, one of the things covered next week. So I won't be saying much about it today. So firstly, the LFS, the main impact ultimately relates to the mode of data collection. that's being used. This doesn't surprise anyone. Face-to-face interviewing has been suspended by most countries, and based on information we collected in 2018, 80% of the countries who provided information were still using face-to-face interviewing as their main mode of data collection for the LFS. So obviously then it's a major impact for very many countries. Those with regular collection have been generally trying to move to their collection to telephone interviewing. And this can either be CATI, in other words, computer assisted, or sometimes it's just using a pen and paper form, but calling the respondents for the information. And the level of the challenge depends on the existing systems, infrastructure, availability of contact details, and so on. And these things vary very substantially across countries. For some, it's a relatively small impact. For others, it's incredibly significant. So this slide, the main purpose is just to give you an overview of the content of the guidance note that we've published, and I'll touch on a couple of the major points in a little more detail. But the way the guidance note works is that we have a couple of scenarios which cover many countries. In this case, it's that face-to-face interviewing has been suspended, and the survey was planned to be done fully by face-to-face methods, either PAPI or CAPI. So the intention for the country then is to try to continue data collection, moving to telephone. And within the guide, we go through some of the main data collection challenges first, such as getting contact details, enabling the phone interviews, and so on. And then we go through some of the related methodological challenges, things like assessing and dealing with non-response and bias, weighting, and so on. And we try to address as many options as we can. So some countries may be able to get contact details, others may have to consider an alternative sampling frame, and so on and so on. So what we've seen from speaking to countries is that while the general challenges are very similar for all countries, the specifics at the country level can be quite different, and therefore the option you can pursue can end up being quite different. And a very important theme that we have in the guide, and that is very important for countries, as Arman has also said, is the assessment of the result, the quality of the result, in particular biases, and then from that assessment deciding both how you can collect the data, but also how you can communicate the data. And there's a major need, there's a huge communications challenge, evidently. So focusing on the contact details, because this is such a big problem, I want to just speak very briefly. The preference, where possible, will be to retain the current sampling design. So where you've already selected it, it even means retaining the same areas or the same households, if at all possible. But many countries are concerned with the lack of contact details. The first challenge will be to assess the possible coverage through different approaches. And this means looking at different alternatives to attach contact details either to the frame or the selected sample. For example, some countries are using introductory letters which are sent to the respondent households, assuming you know address. Various types of searches, merging different sources like electoral registers or whatever might have contact details, assuming you can merge it back to your frame, or various types of local contacts, so snowballing or network-based approach to trying to get the contact details. And countries are using a combination of these things to achieve as high a level of coverage as they can. Now, Arman mentioned this next option, which is to reuse an old sample for which contact details are available. An increasing number of countries are turning to this option, basically turning it into a full sample that you're interviewing the exact same set of households from one period to a next. In general, in normal periods of time, it wouldn't be recommended because of attrition. But at the same time, panel designs are common, so it's not unmanageable. So this is not necessarily a bad approach, but not in all cases, it's not necessarily true that telephone numbers have been captured for that sample. or it may be there for some and not for others. So it's still not a perfect solution necessarily, but it can potentially, if you assess it versus continuing with a new sample, you might find that it's a better option potentially. All others are considering alternative sampling frames. We touch on this in the guidance, and regardless of the option, care is needed to assess the coverage and possible biases that will arise. So, for example, you may have poor coverage of rural areas, but better in urban areas. And you have to consider these things when deciding how to weight the data and how to communicate the data. Touching on a few of the other challenges which are in the guidance, the challenge of enabling the phone interviews. So this will be technological challenges. You may also be looking at COWI, which is web-based interviewing. There will be processes involved. There will even be legal requirements involved, okay, because you may be attempting telephone interviewing for the first time. Then there's the challenge of reviewing questionnaire content. Arman also mentioned this. Many countries are looking at reducing the content to make it feasible for a telephone interview, but you need to maintain the priority items. So we have this, the second note that I mentioned has information on what is top priority information you must maintain in the case of a labour force survey, namely the things that allow you to identify employment, unemployment, and so on. There's a huge challenge of maintaining response rates. So countries are using things like publicity, introductory letters to attempt to maintain response. There'll be a big challenge of assessing the biases. So here it's generally looking at, in advance, looking at the likely bias based on what you know of the coverage of your contact details. And then after the event, when you've actually collected it, again, you need to assess the bias by looking at the sample that was actually achieved. And in this case, there will be options like reviewing your weighting approaches or non-response adjustment. So non-response adjustment isn't used by all countries currently, but it is an option if you feel like you have new types of non-response bias. Like Arman was mentioning, it's no longer random and relatively small, it's now more focused. So this is where you might split your weighting approach into two. You might have a non-response adjustment to deal with the bias in the achieved sample, and you might have a weighting approach to weight to some external total. So these are things countries can consider. There is also an issue about reference period if collections are delayed. So there are options you have to consider. So it's normal that there can be some delay in data collection. You know, you're collecting it a week later, 2 weeks later, but there's generally some outer limit beyond which you don't want to be asking too historically, right? But this, so you have to think at some point about, well, do I continue to maintain my original reference period, which is the ideal, or do I have to try and alter my approach somehow? And we touch on this in the guidance also. And then obviously, as already mentioned, there's a huge issue of assessing quality and deciding on the dissemination strategy. So other things to note, the national circumstances and infrastructure are critical. The challenge is slightly different for every country. So really, I think the final message I'd have at the end of this is really, we've been engaging with certain countries, as I'm sure the other agencies have, and you ultimately have to go into an in-depth discussion at the country level to decide what is feasible. I mean, we can give options from which you can select, but then it comes down to in-depth country level discussion to decide what's really feasible. Some countries who are already entirely using CATI or COWI, I mean, this is some countries in Europe, North America, maybe Australia and New Zealand are close to this, but not quite at this level, are having low impact. And in fact, some lucky few countries are in fact saying response rates are increasing because respondents are easier to contact, but that's a very small number of countries. Some who are partially using CAPI, this might be they use CAPI for the first interview face-to-face and then telephone interviewing. This is many countries in Europe again and in other parts of the world. There is some impact. And even in some cases, they're saying it's very substantial because when they lose the first face-to-face interview, they no longer have contact details for the follow-up interviews. And then others are using PAPI, or fully face-to-face CAPI, and this is where generally there is the most substantial impact. So I already mentioned that we have other notes. Very, very briefly, note 2 is about LFS content, how to treat people in different types of circumstance. So right now we have a massive increase in absences from work, which can be temporary layoffs or maybe not temporary. And that guidance note gives some recommendations on how to treat people in those circumstances. And also there's a general recommendation about using supplementary analysis to try and highlight the impact on COVID. So for example, we don't often highlight in publication the reasons for absence which are reported in response to an LFS. But here they're incredibly interesting because you will have a massive increase in the number of people who are laid off, either temporarily or longer term. Right. So our advice is to use supplementary analysis, which some countries have already been doing. And then note 4 is rapid surveys being considered as a way to generate some data on labour market impact. So, for example, if you really cannot continue with an LFS in this period of time, you might consider a rapid survey to generate some information on the labour force. It won't be a replacement for an LFS, it won't generate comparable data, but at least it gives you some information on impact. And there is a session on that topic next week. So the summary messages to finish off, the challenges are major here. Maintaining any continuity or flow of data will be an important achievement. We should not underestimate that challenge. The challenges vary substantially by country. And the right solution will only be identified through assessment at the national level. Temporary disruption of publication is already occurring in some countries, but the hope, as Arman said, is to not completely lose periods of data. Maybe there's some delay, but you manage to fill in the gap afterwards. And a flexible approach is needed to maintain data collection. For example, you might use admin data to a greater extent if it's available. Reusing old samples, which wouldn't normally be advised, is potential solution here, rapid surveys, and so on. And in all cases, quality assessment and transparent publication approaches will be critical to keep users informed. And finally, my final word is, we do have to consider lessons for the future here. We have seen that those countries with telephone and web interviewing already in place were less impacted. So we have to consider whether the right approach is just to say we will return to face-to-face when restrictions are removed. Inevitably, we may have to do that, but we should also be thinking about longer-term plans to try and improve resilience of the system for the future. And this will be shared, I presume. So this is the links to the different notes that we have produced. So thank you. I'll hand back to Arman or Gemma.
Thank you very much, Karen. So I quickly will move to the third and the last speaker today, who is Jay. Jay is a statistics and monitoring specialist and mix coordinator from UNICEF East Asia and Pacific office. Jay, over to you.
And Jay, it's Gemma here. Just checking in on a time check. We've got about 9 or 10 minutes, please. We'd like to start the questions at 45. Thank you. Jay, we can't.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yes.
Can you see the slide, please?
Yes.
Yes.
We'll see it.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, welcome to the mixed segment of this webinar. So today I will be briefly talking about UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster survey program and the new Mix Plus initiative that we have started recently. That is, telephone-based surveys using the mix as the frame. So briefly the outline of the presentation, I will give a brief overview of the mix for the benefit of those who are not familiar with mix quickly, and then how we are making adjustments to manage the survey operations during the COVID-19. And then I will talk about the Mix Plus telephone survey initiative and some thinking and thoughts about how the household surveys will look like or change in the future. So the mix started during the early 1990s, basically to monitor the World Summit for Children goals. And globally, more than 115 countries have conducted at least one mix, and that is like over 340 surveys. And if you look at the Asia Pacific region, 36 countries have conducted at least one mix, and 24 countries have signed up for the Mix 6. Some of them have already completed, and some of them are in the process of implementing the mix surveys. So when you look at the Mix 6 set of tools, that is covering about 46% of 41% of the household survey-based SDG indicators. And that is one of the highest among all the surveys in terms of the coverage when it comes to SDG indicators. So what we have suggested countries that are doing, mixed activities, we have requested all the countries to stop the field activities. That includes, any kind of field visit or travel or face-to-face interactions, or bringing people together, etc. And then in some countries, the data collections were completed just before the COVID. So we are trying to help them to speed up with the analysis so that the reports and the data can be released very quickly. In that segment, basically, there were some countries, they were like 90% completed data collection or 95%. So we also reviewed those cases and taken decision in terms of just closing that as finished survey and proceeding with the data analysis. Of course, that depends on the the remaining data, if that is not going to have impact on the national estimates. And for some of the upcoming surveys, I think we are working with the countries to make sure that every system is put in place so that we can start the activities very quickly. And when it comes to the Mix Plus, that is the focus of today's presentation. This is the Mix Plus is a new initiative. This is a telephone-based survey, and we have piloted this in Belize. And this telephone survey is taking cue from the World Bank's listening to telephone surveys, and using that same kind of methodology, we are just making some kind of adjustments and some improvements, enhancements as possible to adjust for the mixed survey settings. So basically, this Mix Plus survey uses a subsample from the mix. That is the ideal situation. As you all know, when it comes to telephone-based surveys, there are mainly three options in terms of choosing the samples from. One is, of course, from the existing survey like Mix or any other survey. And then second is using some kind of telephone list that is available and random digit dialing. So Mix Plus surveys or the Mix Plus recommends to use the first option, that is the subsample from the household surveys. That is the best option in terms of the representativeness and to manage the under coverage issues and over coverage issues. So under this Mix Plus methodology, the interviewers will call the sampled respondents either from a call center or from their homes. So they have options. Even if the interviewers are not able to travel, they will be able to make calls from their own home using the devices provided to them. So there is a smart kind of data call management system that is, of course, operated from a central place in terms of allocating interviews, and you will be able to know whether the interviews are completed. If there is a replacement needed, that also done remotely. All those kind of things are there in the the smart call management system that is developed as part of the Mix Plus. And when it comes to the frequency of data collection, I think it is very much flexible, but the recommendation is to collect information on a monthly basis. But it can be quarterly, it can be fortnightly. It depends on the situation. You can make adjustments. But at the same time, when you make changes in the frequency of data collection, one has to make sure that the respondents are informed in advance and their consent is sought before changing the frequency of an agreed kind of data collection mechanism. I think I'm not going too much into the details because of the time. Likewise, the questionnaire have to be very short, and going beyond 15 minutes is not at all advisable. Better to stick to around 10 minutes, the total duration of the call. And when it comes to questionnaire content, there are a lot of flexibility. You can have longitudinal kind of questionnaires kept, and then specific program indicators. And you can also use this for opinion polling and crisis monitoring, etc., etc. And another advantage is you can publish the the results very quickly, immediately after finishing one wave of data collection. One wave, I mean one round, or whatever name if you want, you can use that. So for example, our experience is that one wave normally takes about 10 to 2 weeks of data collection. It depends on the sample size, etc., and how many people are going to be involved in terms of collecting this data. All those parameters are there. But once you finish the data collection for one round, you can publish it the same day or within a day or two. So those are some of the advantages of using this. And currently we are working with Mongolia to implement this, and we are also discussing with a few other countries in this region to implement the Mix Plus. So a few things looking forward as far as the Mix team is concerned. I think we are currently in the process of developing a post-COVID module that is almost in line with the post-emergency module Mix is having. So this will be a little bit enhanced version of the post-emergency module that is already available. And at the same time, we are also, I think the earlier presenters also mentioned in terms of making modifications to the existing questions, etc., because some of them may not be that relevant, or the questions as it is will not yield to the same results or answers you want to get, or the indicator you want to calculate. So for example, if you are capturing education data, I think if you use the same set of questions as before, you will not be getting, whether the child is attending school or not. Likewise, disruptions in, various kinds of services and how you seek even the, medical care, etc. Now, there are a lot of telemedicine services available. So we also have to capture those kind of issues, and we have to make modifications. So we are also working on that, so that the tools are adequate enough to capture those information without missing any kind of data. And another
sorry, Jay, it's Gemma here. I'm just giving you a time check.
Yeah, I'm done. This is the last slide. Then another important thing which we were working with some of the companies is in terms of the anthropometric measurements without making any kind of contact with the children using artificial intelligence methodology, etc. So there are some improvements, and almost some people have informed that they are in the final stages, and those kind of applications also will be available to use in the future surveys without making any kind of physical contact with the children to collect anthropometry data. So previous presenters have already talked about the using mixed methods and approaches in terms of data collection. So I think that also we are looking into as using different combinations of data collection approaches, so that we can bring all those things together and analyze the data. And lastly, we also propose countries to use mixed link. That is basically an option that allows countries to link various kinds of administrative data with the mixed data. For example, you can link with the education management system or the HMIS data and so on and so forth. So because of the time, I'm not going to too much of details of that. So if anybody wants to get more details about that, please feel free to reach out to us. So I think I stop here. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. So we're moving to the question answer part of our discussion. You have kindly shared lots of questions with us. So before I open it for QA, let me. I have looked at all the questions we have received, and they fall into 3 different areas. Or I can ask those questions, and my colleagues can reflect on them, and then we can move to open discussion. And remember, you can use hands up icon on the toolbar so that we know who wants to ask questions. One of the questions that many of you had was about the COVID rapid response survey. That, as Gemma already mentioned, we will have a separate webinar next Monday, and looking forward to see all of you, which will discuss particularly this issue of rapid response surveys for COVID. So I'll skip that kind of question and move to more specific questions on our discussion today. One of the questions was asked by several people is that what if we don't have contact numbers, telephone numbers in our frame? It's a difficult question. It was partially answered in some presentations, but if Karen and Jay would like to add to these questions, please come in. So the question particularly is, what if we don't have relevant information in our frame to switch to a different mode of data collection?
Well, Arman, this is Kieran. Maybe I can come in on that. You're right, it's absolutely a difficult question. There is no guarantee. What we are recommending is that that countries do an assessment of alternatives, right, and be flexible and imaginative, looking at sources they haven't used before. So the ideal, again, the starting point would be that it's a preference to maintain your sample frame and sample design. Okay, so that's the starting point for many reasons. I mean, you've scientifically selected that sample from a representative frame, hopefully, and therefore you want to maintain it. So really, it comes down to a national level discussion of what are the possibilities to obtain telephone numbers for that specific sample that you've chosen. Countries are looking at various possibilities. I'm aware, if I take one country in the Caribbean, it believed that it could use the electoral register because there was sufficient information to link back. But you have to remember, it's not just about having something that has telephone numbers on it. It is something that you can link back to your frame, right? So that means you need to have some sort of common, unique identification or way to match. Then other countries are actually using multiple sources and trying to merge them together, right? But even other countries their starting point is that their sample is based on a selection of areas, so they don't even have unique addresses. So if you're in that situation where the new sample you've selected that you want to start with doesn't even have addresses, then it is a more difficult situation without question, because the first stage of the process would have been to enumerate the area, to list the households. Okay, so you need to, if you're in that situation, you need to assess, is it still feasible for you to go and even list the households in the area, get addresses, get address points, and from there see if you can add telephone numbers or not, right? And if not, you then start looking at, well, are there other sampling frames that might be feasible, like, for example, telephone registers. But there you have to, I think, if you are going to another sampling frame, I mean, you are certainly dealing with incomparability at that point. I think that's inevitable. You may be able to generate data, you may be able to do a survey, but the likelihood of it being comparable to your old survey becomes quite low. And it becomes difficult to even assess bias because you don't have a universe to necessarily compare to. So I would say there are a number of stages of options to go through. And this is where I will come back to this idea of using an old sample. This is why many countries, because of this difficulty, are reusing old samples. Because here you have contact details, hopefully, or at least you have it for part of the sample, and therefore you're only looking at trying to fill in the gap for a remaining sample. And it might be, we're fine for urban areas, we're not fine for rural areas, but then maybe you have telephone numbers for some households, and you can even attempt to use that as a networking way to try and get contact details for others. So that's a quick response. No, it's not easy, but there are options we can consider.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Jay, do you want to add anything to this? Or I can move to the next question.
I think it is fine.
Okay.
I think he answered very well.
Thank you very much. The second question actually is directly to ILO, and it's about how to measure the employment status specifically for those who are unpaid or on unpaid leave with unknown date of return to work. I know this is related to your note 2, but if you can briefly explain this one as well, would be great.
So what the standards say about so they speak about job attachment, that during the period of absence, can you be said to still have an attachment to the job? And normally that comes down to the reason for absence, the duration of absence, and possibly whether you're continuing to receive income. Now, clearly in this case, and this is why we produced that second guidance note, you have a lot of people in this situation. I do not know when I'm going to return, and I may or may not be receiving any income from my employer. So in this specific case, the guidance we've issued says that if you have an expectation of return whenever this lockdown or the restrictions end, but you do not know when that date is, that in this specific circumstance, you could continue to be considered employed, right? Because it's a very unusual circumstance. You do have an expectation of return, but you don't know when the date is, which is unusual. In most circumstances, normally, this is a very small number of people. Now it's a large number of people, so we have addressed that in the guidance. I would recommend that people look at that guidance note, but in general, what we're saying is if there is an clear expectation of return, but the date is unknown, but it will be after the lockdown is ended, we would recommend to continue treatment as employed.
Thank you very much, Kiran. So I now open for question answer. Please remember to use raise hand so that I know who wants to ask question in the list of participants. I see none here.
Arman, it's Gemma here.
Yes,
one of the questions that's been raised by our colleague in India is the ethical question of moving to a like a CAPI or a COWI type survey using information like telephone numbers and whether telephone numbers is actual personal information or not. I'm just wondering whether ILO or a country who already extensively uses CAPI or COWI would like to comment on the ethical issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. Karan, do you want to respond, or other ILO colleagues on the call want to come in?
Yeah, I would think, Arman, there is a legal issue. So what does the legal framework in the country allow? I think in some countries it might not be problematic that so for example, sometimes the telephone numbers are public in any case, right? So it's a matter of whether you can link them back to your frame. But if you are taking them from some source, you need to consider the legality of using a source of information. I mean, then as regards actually reaching out and contacting the respondents, you have this challenge of comforting them, of trying to get their involvement. This is why countries are using publicity so that respondents will be aware. I had heard a very interesting idea from one country very recently that that the NSO will use a certain type of telephone number so that the respondent, when they see it, know it's coming from an official source. So it will be a 4-digit number comes up on your phone indicating it's coming from an official source. Now, ethically, is it okay to use telephone numbers? I would say it depends on how you got them. All right. I mean, if you got them from your previous survey, and you had said to them, we may use this to recontact you, then I don't think it's a major ethical problem. If you got it from a public source, then again, I don't think it's a major ethical problem, but you do have the problem of introducing the survey to the respondent and making them comfortable to respond. So I think you have to take this into account. You also need to consider whether the legal framework is there. Is what you're doing legal? So yeah, it's like everything at the moment. It's a little bit complicated, but it's absolutely something you should consider in your approach.
Thank you, Kiran. Other questions? I can see also that Tite from ILO also is providing some answers in the chat room, so you can read those as well. Any other questions? There was one question regarding adding new questions to the current surveys for assessing the impact of COVID-19, which I think is related to today's discussion rather than a rapid survey. I know that it was also part of the note 4 and partially note 2 of ILO, if Karen want to add to that. So the question specifically was, if you add new questions, how that will impact the quality and also the operation in terms of training of interviewers and others.
Yes, it is something touched on in particular in note 2, so guidance for content. So countries are doing this already. They're adding special questions. We have managed to gather some of those experiences. It's not comprehensive, but if countries would like to have direct contact, we can try and provide some examples. But typically it covers things like when you're asking about reasons for absence and duration, you can either consider adding response categories to existing questions that explicitly mention it's COVID related, or possibly better, you can add a dedicated question saying something like, and is the reason for this due to a COVID-19 restriction, right? So analytically then, that information becomes available to you. And there are countries already starting to publish data now on that type of question. Then other countries are having dedicated separate surveys, but I think it's fair to say those are the countries with additional resources. Now, as regards training for interviewers, right, or the approach to introducing them, of course you have to be careful. So what we would probably recommend is that, you know, you're very specific, you choose very specifically on things like reasons for absence, reasons for changes in working time, and select a few of these areas where it's relevant, maybe reasons for not being available or not looking for work, and focus on those areas where you might expect to see a particular interesting reaction that is COVID related, and in those places maybe add selected things, and do it without breaking the rest of the flow of your questionnaire, right? So 1 or 2 additional questions in places. Maybe if I might, Arman, I noticed a couple of very specific LFS related questions in the chat, so I might very quickly respond. There was one about informality, and yes, informality will be incredibly important at the moment because it's an indicator of possible levels of protection, you know. So people in the informal economy have less protection than others. So it was asked whether this could be a replacement or some sort of view on temporary absence. And what we would say is it's very important information to know about informality if informality is prevalent in the country. So I would retain those questions, but they won't replace questions on absence. You still will need to ask about absence. So I think there was a question along those lines. And one other I noted was about mode effects, the validity of questions and responses between face-to-face and telephone web. There is a lot of experience. In fact, just last week I forwarded to some people a detailed report on multi-mode data collection that was compiled in the EU case. There are mode effects. You do need to adjust your approach. Through good practice, you can hopefully minimize those effects. That's the summary because we don't have much time, but there is one example of a report from the EU which tried to compile a lot of information on this, which we can share through the group as one example, but there are many studies that have been done.
Thank you very much, Karen. Any other question? I see hands here. Lindsay? Is that
Hello?
Yes, please.
Just wondering, in Billy's experience, what's the response with sensitive questions like sexual behavior questions?
Thank you for your question. I think this is for Jay. It's about Mix Plus in Belize.
Thanks for that question. Normally for telephone surveys, we cannot ask or include sensitive questions. So that is one of the limitations of the telephone-based surveys. So we haven't included any kind of sensitive questions in the Belize survey.
Oh, COVID. Yeah. My second question, please.
Sure, go ahead, Lindsay.
Yep. Thank you. Almost the same, similar type of question, but this time, what's the response from Belize experience? Is it a sensitive question related to COVID-19?
Yes, thanks. We have included some, because the Belize pilot started about 8-9 months ago. So we were asking, some other questions about, child labor and the UNICEF related questions before. But in the recent waves, we have included COVID related questions as well. And we have already published some of those results in the Mix website. So it is already available. So recent waves, I think 3 waves, we have included COVID related questions starting from March onwards. Is that answers your question?
Okay, thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Jay. Any other questions? If none, I would like to go back to Gemma to wrap up today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arman, and my great thank you also to Kieran and Tite from ILO and from Jay from UNICEF. It's been very useful to bring the 3 perspectives of the 3 agencies together for survey operations, and really encouraged by the questions that have been asked there today. As Arman said, next Monday at the same time, midday Bangkok time, we will be holding a similar cafe series as today on COVID-19 surveys, standing at rapid response surveys. And we're hoping to have 2 country experiences to bring you. A country experience standing up at rapid response household survey as well as a country experience standing up a rapid response business survey. So for those countries that are also looking at the economic impacts through the business sectors, particularly small, medium enterprises, where we've invited Australia to share their experience in standing up a rapid response business survey. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been great to reach out. We reached out to about 160, 170 people across the region, from countries, from our regional and international partners, and it's been great joining you today. So have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Any further questions, please just send them through to us, and we'll be sharing a recording of this presentation on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. Bye.